Well, hello again, and welcome to Lesson 9 in our study of the book of Revelation. Briefly reviewing our last lesson in chapter 12, we were presented with two signs from heaven. The first one was a radiant woman, pregnant and about to deliver, who is a sign for God's covenant people. And the second one was a great red dragon, poised and ready to devour the woman's child, who is Christ, the moment he is born. That dragon is a sign for Satan. Now, this story is told twice in the chapter from two different vantage points. Verses 1 to 6 tell the story from an earthly perspective. The dragon failed to destroy the woman's child even though he was crucified, because he rose from the grave and ascended into heaven. Now, verses 7 to 12 tell the very same story from the heavenly perspective. The resurrection and ascension of Christ on earth constituted a devastating and final defeat for Satan in the spiritual realm. Sin, his only power over the human race, has been atoned for, and he has been cast out of heaven, and his own everlasting doom has been sealed. Then in verses 13 through 17, in a desperate rage, we see that Satan sets his sights on persecuting the radiant woman and the rest of her children, who are Christ's church. That brings us to today's lesson in chapter 13. The first step in the dragon's program against the church involves the recruitment of allies. And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. As we have already noted, the sea appears to be an apocalyptic symbol for the nations of the earth and the churning, ever-changing, ever-troubled world of sinful, fallen mankind. Out of this sea of humanity, the dragon summons a beast with grotesque characteristics. It has 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 diadems. The imagery here is similar to that of the dragon that we saw in chapter 12 and verse 3. The only difference is that the beast has 10 diadems on his 10 horns, while the dragon has 7 diadems on his 7 heads. The number 10 represents human completeness. The number 7 represents supernatural, otherworldly completeness. So what we are probably meant to understand in the symbolism of the diadems is that while the dragon is Satan, a supernatural being exercising complete power and authority over the forces of evil from the supernatural realm, the beast is a human entity, channeling the dragon's power as his agent in the natural world of mankind. In short, the beast that comes up out of the sea is the Roman Empire, emerging from among the nations of the world. And this empire is Satan's puppet in his war against the saints of the Lamb. The dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. John goes on to say of this beast that on his head were blasphemous names. Now, most of the Roman emperors were endowed with titles that hinted at divine attributes. The first emperor, Octavius, was called Augustus Divus Dominus. Augustus was the Latin word for reverend or to be worshipped. Divus is translated deified, and Dominus is translated Lord. Augustus Divus Dominus, deified man, made Lord, made God, and worthy of being worshipped. Domitian, the reigning emperor at the time of the Revelation, demanded that he be addressed at all times as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Blasphemous names indeed. John continues, "And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion." The image of a swift leopard suggests the phenomenal speed of the expansion of the Roman Empire. Feet like a bear seem to suggest the mauling rampages of the Roman legions in the wars of conquest. And the mouth of a lion perhaps pictures Rome's ability to defeat whole nations and ethnic groups and incorporate them into its empire. And John says, "I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed." This seems to be an allusion to the Nero redivivus myth that was popular in the empire for centuries after the death of that notoriously wicked and cruel emperor in AD 68. Now, although the myth existed in several different versions, the gist of it was that Nero was not really dead, but he had been reborn or brought back to life, redivivus, and was living in seclusion outside the empire. According to the myth, Nero would eventually return at the head of a massive army to either reclaim his throne or to destroy the city that had rejected him. Because of his own sadistic cruelty, the Emperor Domitian was often referred to as the reincarnation of the Emperor Nero in secular literature. And the image of the head whose fatal wound had been healed appears to pick up on this popular association of these two emperors. The ceremonial deification of the emperor eventually led to the growth and development of an imperial religious cult in which the Roman state was worshipped alongside the traditional Roman pantheon. More will be said about this imperial cult later, but for right now, John tells us, "And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war against him?' There was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies. An authority to act for 42 months was given to him. And he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven." The main point here is that since the beast from the sea was empowered and authorized by the dragon, participation in the Roman imperial cult was the same as worshiping Satan, the most severe form of blasphemy against God that there is. Notice that the authority of the beast will last for 42 months. That's the same duration as the trampling of the holy city by the nations that we saw in chapter 11 of verse 2 in our previous lesson. Now, we've already discussed these apocalyptic time references before, but they are so numerous in the book of Revelation that I think we ought to visit them one more time. All of these references are based on a lunar calendar of 12 months, each consisting of 30 days. Now, such a calendar as that was actually observed in very ancient times, although it had long been out of use by the time that John writes the book of Revelation. Yet we see it quite often in Scripture, most notably in the book of Daniel, and therefore it's often referred to as a prophetic calendar. But by this calendar, 42 months would be the equivalent of 1,260 days. In chapter 11 and verse 3, we read that the ministry of the two witnesses lasted for 1,260 days. And in chapter 12 and verse 6, we saw that the duration of the wilderness refuge of the radiant woman was also 1,260 days. But further down, in chapter 12 and verse 14, the same period of the woman's desert refuge is alternately expressed as a time, times, and half a time. If we add up those times according to the formula 1 time plus 2 times plus half a time, which does seem to be consistent with the intent of the text, we come up with a total of 3.5 times. On the 360-day calendar, 42 months, or 1,260 days, equals 3.5 years. 1 year plus 2 years plus a half a year. Now, of course, a time could refer to a year, a month, a week, even a minute. Remember in chapter 11, verses 9 to 11, that the bodies of the two witnesses would lie unburied in the streets for 3.5 days. But what kind of time we're talking about is not the main point here. It's the number of the times. 3.5. That's of prime importance, whether it's 3.5 years, 3.5 months, 3.5 days, 3.5 minutes. It's that 3.5 that is essential to the meaning here. 3.5 is 1/2 of 7. And that's the apocalyptic number for totality or completion. So the significance of 3.5 times, or any of these other images of elapsed time, is that they fall short of completeness. That is, they fall short of forever or of eternity. Remember these apocalyptic terms for elapsed time, because they will come up several times as we continue our study. All of them are variations on a theme, signifying a period of time that is undefined but limited. It will not last forever. And regardless of how they're expressed, all of these apocalyptic time images refer to the same period of time. Whether it's the ministry of the two witnesses, the ascendancy of the dragon and the beast, the persecution and protection of the radiant star-crowned woman, whether it's 3.5 years, 1,260 days, all of these are happening at the same time. And that's the importance of these images for time in the book of Revelation. John says that the worship of the beast and the dragon will be enforced with deadly authority throughout the empire. It was also given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. All who dwell on the earth will worship him. Everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. So John says here that all who dwell on the earth will comply with the demands of the empire and worship the beast. All that is, whose names have not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. Now this sounds like a declaration of fact, a command, and a warning, all wrapped into one. The book of life is a theme at least as old as Moses. After the sin of the golden calf, Moses pleaded with God, "But now, if you will, forgive their sin. And if not, please blot me from your book which you have written. Exodus 32 and 32. In a very different spirit, in one of his Psalms, David prayed for the condemnation of his adversaries. May they be blotted out of the book of life, and may they not be recorded with the righteous. Psalm 69, verse 28. And Paul references this book in Philippians 4 and 3, where he speaks of my fellow workers whose names are written in the book of life. The book of life has already been mentioned in Revelation 3 and verse 5 in context with those on the 7 churches who overcome. And it will come up 4 more times later in the book. Look in chapter 17 and verse 8, chapter 20 and verse 12, and again in verse 15, and in chapter 21, verse 27. But because those whose names are written in the book of life do not worship the beast, he will wage war against them and overcome them. But again, the victory will only be temporary. And we should not overlook a subtle but important point here in this verse. Those whose names are written in the book of life are emphatically distinguished in the text from those who dwell on the earth. The Greek word translated dwell in this verse is katoikeo, which implies living in a place as a permanent resident, sinking down roots in a specific place. Now, in John 1 and verse 14, John wrote of Christ, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But here, the word translated dwelt is skenoo, which carries the connotation of a tent or a temporary residence, something like camping out. So, while those of us whose names are written in the book of life are now living on the earth, we're only passing through. Our true home, our permanent dwelling place, is not in this world. As Jesus made clear to his disciples, if you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this, the world hates you. John 15 and verse 19. And all this enriches the imagery of the radiant woman, whose feet rest not on the earth, but on the moon. Her permanent home is not of this earth, and her children, who are not permanent residents, but only pilgrims on this earth, do not worship the beast. The introduction of the beast from the sea concludes with a solemn declaration. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and the faith of the saints. The rise of the emperor worship cult will come at great peril to the saints of the Lamb, and they must be prepared to endure an even greater degree of persecution than most of them have experienced thus far. For some, like John himself, it will mean captivity and exile. For others, like Antipas of Pergamum, it will mean death. This increased persecution must be met with increased faith and perseverance. And in the final outcome, it will be more than vindicated. In verses 11 and following, we are introduced now to a second beast, this one coming up out of the earth. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and he makes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down out of heaven to the earth in the presence of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which it was given to him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak, and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. The first beast came out of the sea of nations that inhabit the earth. The fact that this second beast comes out of the earth probably means that it comes from within the nation that became the beast out of the sea. In other words, this second beast is of Roman origin. There are 4 characteristics which help to identify this second beast. 1, the 2 horns like a lamb suggest an outwardly pious or religious appearance. The lamb was a religious symbol. Consider the Passover lamb. Consider the Lamb of God. Now, the fact that this lamb has only 2 horns may symbolize the beast's inferiority and limited power as compared to the 7 horns of the Lamb of God in chapter 5 and verse 6. But nevertheless, the 2 horns like a lamb suggest some religious overtones to the function of the second beast. Second, he has the voice of a dragon. That indicates that he speaks with the diabolical authority of Satan himself. Third, he exercised the power of the first beast. In other words, his power was derived from the Roman state or the emperor. And fourth, the beast from the earth has one job, and that is to enforce the worship of the beast from the sea. And thus, whenever he is mentioned after chapter 13 in the book of Revelation, he is called the false prophet. So remember that as we continue. When we see the term false prophet, we are referring to this second beast from the earth. All these characteristics seem to identify the second beast as the Roman commune, or concilia. This was an official body composed of deputies whose duty was to build images of Domitian and to place altars in all the imperial shrines or temples. The concilia was free to establish any legislation necessary to enforce the imperial cult. The cult requirements seemed benign enough. All that the subjects of the empire were required to do was to burn a pinch of incense on an imperial altar once a year as a sign of loyalty or reverence for the emperor. Those who did so were given a token or a stamp as evidence that their imperial cult requirements had been fulfilled for that year. After that, they could worship any god they pleased. But failure or refusal to burn the pinch of incense to the emperor could carry the death sentence. Well, besides the possibility of execution, the consequences of refusal to worship the emperor brought trouble to the Christian community in almost every facet of their lives. They were boycotted in the marketplace when they could not produce the credentials proving that they had burned the pinch of incense to the emperor. Marriage licenses, wills, transfers of property, none of those legal transactions were possible without evidence of their having complied with the requirement to worship the emperor. And all of these things intensified the suffering endured by the church and increased the power of their persecutors. John and his readers knew the sweeping power of the imperial cult only too well, since it was better organized and enforced in Asia Minor than in any other part of the Roman Empire. And so this provides historical context for verses 16 through 18. And he causes all, the small and the great, and the rich and the poor, and the free men and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to buy or to sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. For the number is that of a man, and his number is 666. Okay. Deducing the significance of the number 666, has been an interpretive playground for biblical scholars for centuries. In both the Greek and Hebrew languages, every letter had a corresponding number. That's the source of the Roman numerals that we're familiar with even today. But adding up the total of the numbers in a name gave a numeric value to that name or to the word. So the question has been, whose name has a numeric value of 666? Well, the most popular answer has been Neron Kaiser. That's the Greek form of the Latin name Nero Caesar. Now, when that Greek name is transliterated into Hebrew alphabetic characters, in other words, when you take the Greek name Neron Kaiser and make those same sounds with Hebrew alphabetic letters, then those Hebrew characters yield a number value of 666. But it only works when you transliterate the name into Hebrew. It doesn't work in Greek. And so this interpretation seems to be an impossible stretch, since the original recipients of the revelation spoke Greek, not Hebrew. Such an association with the Hebrew numerical system would be lost on them. Now, while it's probably best to simply allow the mystery to remain a mystery, there is an alternative explanation which may be worthy of our attention. First, we must remember that the overall message of chapters 13 and 14 is that the two beasts are liars. They're trying to deceive those who live on the earth into believing that the first beast, with his blasphemous names and blasphemous speech, is a divine being deserving of their worship. And next, we need to remember a couple of familiar apocalyptic motifs. The number 7 typically indicates supernatural or divine completeness and perfection. The trebling or tripling of an attribute or quality renders an emphatic, superlative quality to the attribute that we're talking about. For instance, holy, 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 in chapter 4, verse 8. It's saying God is holy to the nth degree. Now, since the number 6 falls just short of the number 7, it could reasonably suggest the idea of falling short of the divine majesty symbolized by the number 7. And the trebling of the number 6 into 666 might be an apocalyptic construct to leave no doubt that the beast is not a god and is not deserving or worthy of worship from those who dwell on the earth. Far from it. And thus John writes, "Here is wisdom, knowing that the powerful, blasphemous, murderous beast is, in fact, not God." Thus, in chapter 13, the stage is set for a mortal conflict, with the forces of Satan embodied in the two beasts on one side, and the suffering but persevering saints of the Lamb, the rest of the seed of the radiant woman, on the other. What will be the outcome of this conflict? That's the subject of chapter 14, which we will consider in our next lesson.